The opinions expressed on the radio program by the hosts, co-hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions and responsibility of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Genesis Radio, www.genesisradio.com, Genesis Radio's owners, management, or affiliates.
Good evening. It's another Thoughts for Thursday, and you're on the air with Reason for Reason, and I'm your host, Ron Yates. Well, folks, it's been a little while since we've been on the air. We haven't really, I don't think we've been here since the change of seasons, and I tell you what, it's a welcome change. After January, February, it feels good to experience some sun and some vitamin D again, natural vitamin D. So I want to talk to you today about something I kind of stumbled across. On my way to work one morning, stopped in the store, and I'm not sure what outlet it was. I know it wasn't a typical American outlet, but I saw a news outlet, and I still have to find out which one it is, because I'd like to be able to check out this news outlet more closely. Anyway, I looked up, and I saw on the bottom of the screen where the state of Israel had been brought to the International Court of Justice. And there was actually trial proceedings against the state of Israel. And I was kind of taken aback, like, well, Israel is one of America's closest allies. America has supported Israel from its foundation in 1948. Every year, America sends a healthy chunk of aid to the Israeli government, and yet not so much as a peep of information about this trial against the state of Israel. So I want to know more about this trial. So I went and I looked it up. And what's interesting is Israel was brought to the Court of International Justice by the South African government. So I want to read a little bit about their petition. The petition is dated the 26th of January, 2024. And it states, application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel. Request for the indication of provisional measures. The court begins by recalling that on 29 December 2023, South Africa filed in the registry of the court an application instituting proceedings against Israel concerning alleged violations in the Gaza Strip and of the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, hereinafter the Genocide Convention. So I think you kind of get the gist of the application by South Africa. The South African government was apparently concerned about the images that were coming out of Gaza and the West Bank. In fact, what remains of what used to be Palestine. So much so that they filed this petition with the International Court of Justice for them to investigate their allegations. Now, I mean, I could go on. This stuff, the information I printed out is probably a dozen or so pages long, and it gives in more detail the basis of their argument against the Israeli government. And again, I just found it interesting that the U.S. government, probably Israel's closest and strongest ally, never mentioned anything on our news. Well, why? if the Israeli government is doing nothing wrong except defending itself, why not show these images of these court proceedings on networks like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, and a host of others? But nothing. I find that, not just interesting, but disturbing. It makes you wonder about the validity of some of the facts given to us by people like Benjamin Netanyahu. According to Mr. Netanyahu, the real culprit in this ongoing, I don't want to say war, because I believe a war involves two warring parties. And in this case, Palestine is in no position to wage war with the state of Israel. Israel is the best equipped, best trained military in that region of the world, hands down, no question. Israel also, and it has been believed now since the 1960s, that Israel has a stockpile of nuclear weapons. Of course, that is something that they don't share with anyone. In fact, when it was found out, they denied it. And this goes back to the Kennedy administration, that Israel had been able to acquire a nuclear device, or should I say multiple nuclear weapons. Anyway, this was just a petition that was filed. It was now in the hands of the International Court of Justice in The Hague to determine if there was any validity to South Africa's claims against the Israeli government. So I'm going to read a little bit of the court's findings as it relates to the accusation made by South Africa. In January, the ICJ delivered an interim judgment, and one key paragraph from the ruling drew the most attention. In the court's view, the facts and circumstances are sufficient to conclude that at least some of the rights claimed by South Africa and for which it is seeking protection are plausible. This was interpreted by many, including some legal commentators, to mean that the court had concluded that the claim that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza was plausible. Folks, these are my words. These are the findings from the justices at the International Court of Justice. Now, I believe that there are three sides to every story. There's my side, there's the opposing side, and then maybe somewhere in the middle is some truth. I think that if you give people enough information, that most people would reach the right conclusion. I think that in this particular conflict, a lot of information is being left out, a lot is being distorted, a lot is being obfuscated purposely. But despite that, now in the information age, images are being beamed around the world of what's happening in the region. Many of these images are not favorable to Israel, something that the Israeli government is not accustomed to. When has the Israeli government, namely Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet members, or ranking cabinet members, when have they ever been brought before a judicial body? Yes, I'm aware that Netanyahu had some legal issues in Israel, allegations of fraud and mismanagement and other things, but somehow those charges didn't stop him from being reelected as prime minister. You know, a lot of people who are looking at what's happening in what's called the Middle East, namely in Israel, in Palestine, I don't know how much they actually know about the origin of this conflict. I know a lot of people are under the belief, or I guess lack of information, for, as a better term, about how this conflict began. A lot of people point to October 7th, 2023. And on that date, according to our media, which has said nothing about this trial against Israel, our media reported that Hamas attacked Israel by land, sea, and air. It's a splashy headline, but is there any truth to it? The part by land, sea, and air, it would suggest that the Palestinians, or more precisely Hamas, has access to naval vessels and also aircraft. Fact of the matter is, Hamas, or any military body in that region, or at least in Palestine, has access to neither naval or aeronautic weapons platforms. They simply don't have them. Hamas, which I'm not quite sure yet, I'm going to do some more research to find out who actually created Hamas. We found out in the years after 9/11 that some of these so-called terrorist organizations were created, funded, and trained by the American government. I don't know if the government will even try to deny it anymore, because there are documents that have leaked out that clearly show that some of these people that we call foes and enemies of the state were in fact CIA assets, one of which was Osama bin Laden. But anyway, let's get back to conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Historically, the origin of this conflict, I mean, you can go back hundreds of years, right? But in reality, it's more closer to the years and months leading up to the establishment of Israel as a state. It kind of began in the latter half of the 19th century. The Jewish population of Europe, rather, was seeking a homeland. Now, I read a book some time ago. It's a little small book, maybe, I don't think there's 100 pages in it. It's written by a Jewish scholar by the name of Norman Finkelstein. Some of you from the New York area may be familiar with him. He taught at a couple of colleges in the New York area, one of which I know was Hunter College. Anyway, his book is entitled The Other 1492, and he talked about the start of the Spanish Inquisition. And he also gives in pretty clear detail the dates, or the approximate dates, when Jewish people would run out of every country in Europe, sometimes on more than one occasion. Well, that being the case, in probably the late 1890s, I want to say, a man by the name of Chaim Weizmann and others formed the Zionist movement. And the aim and purpose of the Zionist movement was to find a home for the Jewish people. they advocated to mostly the British Empire and, or should I say, the British government, and to Lord Rothschild. Well, during World War One, a document was signed. It called the Balfour Agreement. And essentially, what the Balfour Agreement was supposed to do, it was supposed to subdivide Palestine so that there would be a Jewish section of Palestine and a Muslim section. Well, for whatever reason, that decree, if you will, was never carried out. So the Jewish population of Europe was still without a homeland. It wasn't until the end of World War II that the Balfour Agreement was actually executed, if you will, and the land of Palestine was divided. I think during that time, about 77% of the land was given to the Jewish refugees fleeing Europe in the Holocaust. Well, of course, the Palestinians who were there for centuries were not happy with the results, losing so much of their land, much of it farmland, some of it having sources of fresh water, and they essentially being pushed out into the desert. There are a number of documentaries, some well-written documentaries. One of them is a documentary I saw called 1948 Creation and Catastrophe. And if you get a chance, look at that documentary. And there's one that came out relatively recently. We have a caller joining us. Hello, caller. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Hey, what's happening, Brother Yates? How are you this evening?
I'm good, thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you very much for asking. So I wanted to ask you some questions. I'm listening to things that you're saying.
Uh-huh.
So right now, just in this pretty much this time period, there's something going on in Africa where these brothers are trying to unite and actually pretty much unite the rest of the African countries. Yet they keep running into these roadblocks. Like, I forget the brother's name, but he says the people don't have to pay any taxes, the businesses don't have to pay any taxes, and the money that the government needs they'll get the money from the resources that they have available. Because he's kind of pissed off because he's like, look, you got all these other colonial people that come in here and they're making all this money on our resources, but we're not making anything. They're keeping us poor. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you're referring to Captain Ibrahim Traore, and he's currently the leader of Burkina Faso. Well, I think what's happening is, or should I say, I know what's happening. Right now, the European former colonial powers are sort of in a state of, I guess, conflict. And I'm not talking about, a shooting war. I'm just talking about there's some conflict, there's some economic conflicts. There's been some long-standing economic agreements that have been broken. There's been some military agreements, long-standing ones like NATO, that the U.S. wants to pull out of and wants to reduce or eliminate funding to NATO. For centuries, the colonial powers would work together to maintain a grip on Africa, to be able to siphon off Africa's resources without paying for them. In fact, to have complete control over them by putting in puppet governments that would simply allow them to come in and take whatever they want. Well, with the European powers in conflict and having those agreements broken, Europe right now is really not in a position to, I guess, undertake some of the actions that they've taken in the past. I was talking to somebody the other day. In about 1960, Patrice Lumumba was elected the first democratically elected prime minister of Congo, and he got independence from the Belgian Congo and King Leopold. Well, because he would not capitulate to the demands of the Belgians, well, the colonial powers, the U.S. included, got together and they saw to it that Patrice Lumumba was horribly um, mistreated, abused, tortured, and eventually killed, and his body burned. Um, they did not want the idea of independence to spread across Africa. And that is what Patrice Lumumba had in his mind. And that is what Captain Traore of Burkina Faso and a growing number of other African countries have in mind. But right now, I don't think that the Europeans are in position.
What is it? Every time we try to get out the struggles, do for ourselves, and it just seems like they just want to keep pulling us down and keep us down. I was listening to Fox News, and Trump was calling the man a terrorist. I said,
well,
why is he a terrorist? Because he's trying to build his own country and then have other countries unite alongside with it to make a united Africa. I think it's because if Africa actually unites, they would definitely be a world power, without a doubt.
Well, Trump calls people who burn Teslas terrorists, right? So he has his own concept of justice. But the issue is that in order for America to maintain its military powers, it needs strategic metals or rare earth minerals and other strategic minerals that come out of Africa and are only found in Africa. So if America cannot reach an agreement or agreements in Africa where they have puppets in place, where they can take whatever they want, well, then America and their European allies are in a lot of trouble. I mean, let's be realistic. The crown jewels are in England. Well, where are the diamond mines in England? And throughout Europe, right, you have just tons and tons of gold stolen from the African continent. You have African antiquities, works of art worth billions of dollars sitting in museums throughout Europe. And some of these African nations have demanded that their antiquities be returned. As I said before, I don't know if the Europeans are in a position right now, since they're going through their own internal struggles, to do much in a way of upsetting the plans of people like Captain Traore, and the fact that both China and Russia are in Burkina Faso and other African countries, and they are offering military advice, training, and I guess the use of technology in assisting the African governments in maintaining their independence and staving off the threat from Europe and their Western allies.
Wow. I tell you, I hope that they don't harm that brother in any way, because it seems like every time we start to rise up and unite, our leaders disappear, man.
Well, I'm sure that is the plan, right? If they could, they would take them out. However, right now, the Russians and the Chinese are in Burkina Faso, and as I said, other countries. And, they've been dealing with things like clandestine activities for years. Russia itself conducts these sort of activities. So they know what to expect, and they're advising the president of Burkina Faso and others on what they should watch out for. And I guess they're also helping them to train their military in the event, and it's an unlikely event, that the U.S. or others would attempt to launch a strike against certain countries in Africa. I think that would only bring together the African nations in a much stronger relationship because I think they're all aware of what's happening socially, politically in this country and around the world. Africa, like people in this country, are beginning to wake up and to realize, after so many years of slumber, what's happening.
You just said a bad word.
Probably, yeah.
Did you say a word like woke?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that was a bad word in the country.
Well, it makes you wonder why the government wants to keep people asleep. And the answer is, it's easy to rob someone's house when they're sleeping. It's a lot more difficult when they wake up and recognize that there's someone in their house that doesn't belong there.
Absolutely.
And
100%.
Mm-hmm. And people in this country, and I said around the world, are waking up and they're realizing that we have thieves amongst us that are taking at will, and it's becoming more and more difficult for them to do that because the people are waking up and recognizing that there are burglars approaching.
The way you say that, it reminds me of a word that I learned not too long ago, robber barons.
Right.
Kind of what they remind me of. They're robber barons.
Mm-hmm.
They're the rich taking from the poor.
It's always been that way, right? That has been throughout history. The thing is, what was the powers that be were finally able to do was to convince the masses that they need to protect the thief, right? And you saw that on January 6th. You saw that people, working class people, poor people, came down to Washington to protect the billionaire. You see that, around the world. You see where people have raised armies of poor and working class people to go off and fight war that they'll never benefit from. An example of that is the Vietnam War. The people that fought the war, if you look at their socioeconomic status, these were not rich people, these were poor people. People that were not highly educated, people that could not afford to go to Canada to avoid the draft. So you had a lot of poor people sent to Southeast Asia to fight other poor people. What beef did a man in Harlem or the South Bronx have with a man in South Vietnam? Or in North Vietnam, for that matter? They didn't know one another. It was not the Vietnamese that had instituted segregation. It was not the Vietnamese that was lynching people in the Deep South. Our ancestors, our family members. It wasn't the Vietnamese. It wasn't the Vietnamese that said, well, we got one drinking fountain for black, one for white. So why would we go off to fight people in Vietnam who had no intention of harming us in any way, form, or fashion? But you can convince people.
Muhammad Ali was like the best example of why we shouldn't go to Vietnam or participate in any war, because he said it best. They never called me nigga.
Absolutely. And he was right that there was no real reason for Black Americans to find themselves in the rice fields of Southeast Asia, namely Vietnam, fighting these poor people who only wanted independence for their homeland. It's the same thing that Dr. King was fighting for here in this country. But again, if you can convince people to fight for the corporations, for the wealthy, then, you've won. And we have people in this country right now that will tell you that Social Security, which they pay for their entire lives, is an entitlement. If you repeat a lie often enough and loud enough, it becomes reality for some. And in many people in this country, it's become reality.
That they got going on, because they're saying a lot of us, as far as African Americans, that we shouldn't participate.
You know what? I don't know if it is the time for us to participate right now. I think that this war is one that is being fought. This is an ideological war, right? You have people on the far left and people who are on the far right who are just not able to come together and recognize certain things that they should be able to recognize. And over the years,
All right, brother. I got the book a little, but thank you for the good information and the advice. All right, I really appreciate it. Have a really good show, man.
all right,
And
thank
I'll
you for
tune in
calling.
next week.
Thanks for calling.
All right. Peace.
Well, folks, that was a good friend of mine and a gentleman that I have a show with on Tuesday called Politricking, Kendall Stevenson. And he has his own show that you can hear on his platform called The Empowerment Show. But I'd like to get back to a little bit about this conflict, Israel and the Palestinians. So I think I left off talking about the formation of the Zionist movement and how that led to the Balfour Agreement, and then the Balfour Agreement actually being executed after World War II. 1948, and we're talking 77 years ago, Israel became a state recognized throughout, you recognized in the United Nations and around the world. And of course, the Palestinians who lived there for a number of years, in fact, hundreds, thousands of years, were not happy with what was being done to them. Their state being divided and the division heavily in favor of the Israelis, whose numbers were much smaller than those of the indigenous population or the Palestinians. Now, I know it is said by some that when the refugees from the Holocaust arrived into Palestine, it was a land with no people, for people with no land. But of course, there are documents, hundreds of them, photos, history, that show that these people, these Palestinians, were in fact living there and had been there for centuries. Well, over time, through wars and attrition, more and more land was taken. So now, what was once the nation, the land of Palestine, has been reduced to just a strip of land that we refer to as the Gaza Strip. And even that is currently in jeopardy as Israel continues to launch attacks against that small strip of people, that small strip of land, and against the remaining population, which is dwindling. I think since the start of this conflict, which, as I said, began October 7th, 2023, well over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. And reports are that the vast majority are women and children. Well, folks, this conflict, it didn't just begin, didn't just begin 2 years ago. It's been going on for much longer. And I think that for us, American people that support Israel socially, politically, economically, I think we need to have a voice, perhaps a much stronger voice, as it relates to what's going on in this region. I think that for, not just for the Palestinians, but for our own moral sense of right, we need to speak out. We need to say killing has to stop. We need to say that the land grabs that Israel has been taking advantage of, that has to stop. I don't think anyone will deny the fact that Israel has a right to defend itself and has a right to exist. And that can be said of all nations. The question is, do Palestinians have a right to exist? Do they have a right to self-determination? Do they have a right to exist? So I think that we need to be more vocal to our government, and perhaps our government will take a novel approach and for once listen to us and decide that they will confront people like Benjamin Netanyahu and reel him in and let him know that we can no longer abide by the killing, the mass killings of innocent people. We will no longer send our tax dollars to support a regime that will use such tactics that causes the death of women and children. Now, I know, as I said from the start, there are three sides to every story. And I would be very open to having someone from the Jewish community to come and sit down and discuss this on air with me. I also offer that same invitation to members of the Palestinian community who want to come on and present their side of what's happening in the region. I think that, as I said, if you give people the right information, then they'll probably come to the right conclusion. And I think that all sides need to be heard. I think that in order for people to form the proper opinion, they have to have the proper information. I think that information could be gleaned from having both sides come into the studio and talk about it. And then the listeners, will be able to make a determination on who sounds more credible, whose story is more plausible. And I think that for our American media, corporate control media, I think that we need to get the truth for once. Accurate reporting, instead of reporting that is slanted heavily in favor of one group or another, or one side of the aisle or the other. That's not news. That's propaganda. And we've had enough of that over the years. So, folks, I hope that something that is said in these Thoughtful Thursdays, in a little time I have with you, that it'll begin to get you to question some things. Maybe take a look at some information that you never really considered before. That's how we all start. Something we hear, something we see sparks some interest, and then we begin to go out and do some research and find out for ourselves what is really going on. And I think there is so much, not just about the conflict in the Middle East, but so much that is going on in our own country right here in these 50 states that we call the United States, that we simply do not know. Many of us don't really know the inner workings of our government, nor do we know what our government has been doing in our name for a very long time. Many of us, if we knew some of the things that our government has been involved in, and we're talking involved in for more than a century, people would consider revolt. If we knew the amount of money our government wastes on things like war. And then they tell people who make $40,000 or $50,000 a year, who can barely keep food on the table, that they're the wasteful ones. People who are on Social Security, Medicaid or Medicare, they can't afford Medicaid or Medicare. that is unsustainable. But war somehow is sustainable. We fought in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 long years. We spent some estimates of $2 trillion. And how much damage did we do in Iraq and Afghanistan? $2 trillion. That would have funded Medicare, Medicaid, would have been a boost to Social Security. I saw a news story where the former head of Social Security under the Biden administration said that Social Security normally maintains a surplus of about $3.6 trillion. Trillion with a T. That's why our government is talking about entitlement. That's why our government wants to condition us to believe that this isn't something we deserve, because they want to get their hands on it. Just imagine what our government would do with $3.6 trillion. Just imagine what they can do with unchecked power and a Congress that is silent and a Supreme Court that essentially signs off on whatever the executive branch requires. They would blow through that money in no time, enriching their billionaire buddies, building new homes, new vacation homes, exotic vacations. Isn't that what happened after the market crash in 2008? When CEOs went down to Washington on private aircraft and told members of Congress, hey guys, we need some money. And when Congress asked how much, they said, we're going to need billions. They tell us we need to wait, be patient. I think it took a few days for Congress to approve billions of dollars in taxpayer funds to go to the same people that created this mess that was the collapse of 2008. And when they got that money, one of the first things they did was they decided we need to pay bonuses. Yeah, that's right. I said bonuses. How do you pay somebody a bonus who has nearly bankrupted the U.S. economy? Is that something they were doing a good job to you? But that's what happened. These top CEOs and their lieutenants got bonuses. What did the rest of us get? Did we lose our jobs? Did some of us lose homes? Did we lose our investments? What about 401ks that we were banking on that we would have to fall back on in our golden years? Folks, we are being fleeced. And many of us don't recognize it because we are hyper-focused on party politics. So we only look at maybe one or two news outlets, and they're basically saying the same thing. We don't talk to anybody who doesn't share our political views and values. We only want to talk to those people who sound like we sound, who agree basically with what we agree upon. But you're never really getting any other source of information, are you? You're just hearing the same things over and over and over. And look at what's happening to this country. America used to be, or the American dollar was for decades, going back to after World War II, the second strongest currency in the world. Today, we've probably dropped down to somewhere between 8 and 10. How did that happen? America used to manufacture some of the finest clothing, electronics, durable goods, cars, anywhere on the planet. We've closed our factories down. We send them overseas. And the government tells us it's not their fault, it's the fault of the Chinese. Well, who made the decision to close these factories? I don't recall seeing Chinese businessmen sitting in on these corporate decisions. Folks, as I said, we're being fleeced. And because we remain silent, the fleecing just becomes more frequent. They take, but they don't give anything. Just look at what's happening to our veterans facilities, the hospitals, the clinics. Some of them are closing. Some of them have to drastically reduce staff. And these are the men and women that fought for this country. Some of them paid the ultimate sacrifice. Folks, I know the government says there's something horribly wrong with being woke. Well, change the O to an A and just say, wake up. Look around at what's happening in this country. Take a critical look. And if you still think that this country is great and headed toward greatness, then I applaud you. I think you're delusional, but I applaud you. And I support you because of your strong convictions. But the reality is, America's in a lot of trouble. I don't think we can delude ourselves anymore. This country is in a great deal of trouble. So, folks, that's pretty much my time for tonight. So it's a pleasure to come on and share with you, those who call in, those who listen around the country. I just hope you will continue to support Genesis Radio and all its platforms. We're pretty much on the air all day long, bringing you information that you're not going to hear on the corporate control media. It's an independent platform where we get to say things. Well, let me not say we say things. We tell the truth. Some truth that it may hurt some, but yeah, there's an old saying, the truth hurts. And while we don't mean to cause any harm, we do mean to wake you up. We do mean to let you know that it's time to throw off the sheets, wake from your slumber, and get up out of the bed, because America's on fire and the wildfire spreading rapidly. So, folks, with that, I'm going to say good night. I hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here next week for another Thoughtful Thursday. Good night.